The animation of everything in the game, as well as all the backgrounds, were created with rendering techniques on the Silicon Graphics computers.
Am I gonna have to buy an adapter for my home Nintendo?
Not at all. In fact, when the game was created on the Challenge, it was basically specially output to the Super Nintendo game system. So it basically comes in a cartridge, you stick it in the system, and you play.
The visual quality and the speed and interactivity of the gameplay have been amazing. I can't wait for you as the World Game Players to be able to get your hands on this.
Video Game Companies has revitalized a classic just in time to make it on Santa's list. This is a new 3D version of Nintendo's Donkey Kong.
Donkey Kong Country is truly perfect. If you do not get this amazing new generation of Donkey Kong madness, you are stupid.
Hey there! Now when you think about the 90s, what comes to mind? Cartoon shows, movies, music? That one thing some people won't shut up about? It's very obvious that the last decade of the 20th century stuck around in the public consciousness for quite a long time now. More so especially when you were on the internet. Even 20 years ago when it was starting up, talks of advancing technology were exciting us with how innovative and groundbreaking computers and machines were as they were taking us to the next millennium. But among the many inventions and popular items of the 90s came the rise of computer graphics animation. Sure, we had it as early as the 60s, but it wasn't really perfected up until the 90s and the 2000s. And quite possibly the most evident form of, well, evidence of this, can be seen by looking at video games over the years. And when talking about the 90s in particular, you got a game that looked like this in the beginning, and another that looked like that by the end. Now, I'm not sure if everyone shares the same sentiment as me, but I truly believe that this decade had the most progression in terms of how we present our games. And if we're talking about important milestones in gaming history, Rare's collaboration with Nintendo to create Donkey Kong Country has to be one of the more significant ones out there. If not for bringing more state-of-the-art technology towards gaming, at least in keeping Nintendo afloat a little longer until the N64 arrived. But in detailing this story, we have to study 3 separate histories to get to our conclusion. 3 important aspects of one grand story, each bearing their own ingredients to truly make Donkey Kong into the revolution no one could have ever imagined that he actually would be. So let's jump in. Now, Nintendo's history in all this is pretty easy to pick apart. We all know about 1889, the card company, and making a bunch of toys and accessories before eventually settling for video game-related ventures and becoming one of the big 3 today. There's a million things to talk about in Nintendo's history, but let's focus on the steps that led to where we're going for this video. Now, Nintendo, as a video game company, began to pick up on the radar once they started making arcade games. Combined with the success of the Game & Watch series of games and seeing how well companies like Atari were doing, they decided to try their hand at the still quite primitive home console market. Unfortunately, this would come right around the time of the 1983 video game crash, which pretty much made it impossible to sell consoles in North America.
Stick in the catalyst. Use the force. It's coming too fast. It's Ray! It's Ray! My shields are gone! All right! I'm going in!
So, Nintendo didn't sell theirs as one at first. That's why in Western markets you got stuff like the entertainment system or the game pack. You know, it's just a bunch of fluff just to say, hey, this ain't a game console, this ain't an Atari. We're making toys here. You see, electronic video games just wouldn't sell. They had to be branded differently in what would be one of the earliest times the West would try to put their own spin on major Nintendo products. Anyways, time passes, the new Nintendo console becomes big in the West during the mid to late 80s, with Mario becoming the worldwide flag bearer for the company. Gee, I wonder what's so special about him. And as time passes, so does the progression of technology, and games become better over time through practice and hardware. With all the video games being produced and more potential competitors coming into the fold after seeing Nintendo's success, now there's opposition, and a new need to improve and market furiously. Suddenly, things started becoming about bits and internal hardware specs instead of just playing a game. One of the NES's first serious competitors, and I put serious in very vague terms due to how dominant it was in the 80s, was the Sega Master System, which Sega would later boast proudly in replacing it with the 16-bit Genesis, or Mega Drive. Other consoles were joining in the fray as well, like the TurboGrafx-16 and the Neo Geo, neither of which looked too bad when compared to what Nintendo was offering in the 80s. But hey, Nintendo were stoked at first when both were released, but once their lead in sales were dwindling, there was an urge to get out a successor to the Famicom.
Introducing the next generation from Nintendo.
The Super Famicom, or the Super Nintendo, was finally released in Japan in 1990, while North America had to wait until the following year. And hey, check this out. Sonic the Hedgehog was released in North America in June 1991, both before the release of the Super Nintendo and Super Mario World. Ouch. Now, something about Sonic himself appealed to the West a lot, that it kind of shifted the culture of gaming itself. You know, this idea of attitude and expression in games were evolving. Suddenly, Nintendo was more worried on its Western gaming market and the idea that it would lose them. Nintendo couldn't just be a game console anymore. It had to be a way of life, a part of culture, something revolutionary and worth the cost. And most importantly, something that the West could invest in. And fast too, because Sega was prepping up some heat for late 1993. During the NES days, many pioneer developers from the early arcade years of gaming made the transition to jump onto the home console market. Among those people were brothers Tim and Chris Stamper, who previously made a bunch of hits on the ZX Spectrum and a myriad of other consoles. And yeah, back then they were known as Ultimate Play of the Game, which is a pretty weird name, but they were founded in England. And when they heard Nintendo was importing games internationally for their new Famicom console, they saw an opportunity to make a name for themselves instead of just dominating the UK market. At the time though, Nintendo was apparently known for being strict when it came to allowing outside developers to make games for them, much less Western developers. So to kind of give themselves a leg up, they decided to study the Famicom and really see what it was capable of to take some notes for the future. Fast forward a bit in time, and the Stamper brothers founded their new company Rare, and saw themselves in an opportunity to show Nintendo what they got. Long story short, they brought tech demos with them, Ninty saw them, they were so impressed with these people they've never worked with before, that they not only allowed them to produce games for the system, but gave them what a lot of people described as an unlimited amount of budget. And thus began the legendary partnership between Rare and Nintendo. They began making game after game, working with publisher after publisher to create around 60 games for the NES. Slalom? They made that. The NES port of Marble Madness? They made that. Snake Rattle and Roll? They made that. RC Pro-Am, the game that would inspire Super Mario Kart? They made that. Freaking Battletoads? They made that. They even managed to make a couple of Game Boy ports and licensed games, but we don't talk about those. So it seems like Rare's huge NES game making profit was, well, profitable. But once the SNES arrived on the scene, things became a little tricky. They knew everything about the NES as if it were the back of their hand, but had spent no time studying the new console before its launch. If we could go back to Battletoads again, look, great game, but it was first released in June of 1991, and by then the Super Famicom was already out in Japan. Now they had this new console that Nintendo was pushing that they knew absolutely nothing about. Furthermore, they had to find a way to be innovative with it if they wanted to keep their stock as high as it had been before. Suddenly an idea popped into their mind. Rare still had a bunch of money. Let's slow down on the games and get some new tech. It was at this point that Rare decided to spend their NES profits on Silicon Graphics computer workstations, the same machines that made early CGI and stuff like films and commercials possible. Now I think it's fair to say that Rare had gotten a hand of 3D perspective back on 8-bit cartridges, but with these babies, now they could create something realistic on a console that doesn't look ugly for once. Rare would then make a boxing game demo for the Super Famicom using the new technology, showed it to Nintendo, and once again impressed, the Japanese company would invest a lot of their money on Rare's new crazy schemes. This time, they bought a 49% share of Rare, which would effectively make them a second-party developer, which meant that they would only exclusively work on games for the Super Nintendo. Question is, with Nintendo looming right behind your back and trusting you with their time and money, what's the best game to make now? Well, here comes the big lump himself. Donkey Kong was one of Nintendo's first smash hits in the gaming scene, and really one of the first times the gaming character actually kind of mattered. I mean, his name is in the title. Sure, there's barely a plot by today's standards, but an ape called Donkey Kong that steals a woman, it just kinda sticks. Bunch it in with an obvious reference to King Kong. In fact, the game was great for 1981, and it was an unforgettable experience, I'm sure. One annoying lawsuit claimed that didn't go anywhere later, and DK was one of Nintendo's first recognizable names. Donkey Kong Jr. was released the following year and was also a hit, now making two Primates popular for Nintendo. Then the focus would shift to Mario for a while. A long while that would last even up until today. When the NES came and went, Donkey Kong kinda got lost in the dust. Maybe from the video game crash of '83, maybe from Mario and Luigi's rise to prominence, Or maybe even Donkey Kong Jr. Math being one of the NES's low points just by simply being an overpriced calculator in a cart. But the Big Ape wouldn't be seen in a new game for almost a decade up until... Donkey Kong for Game Boy! Well, kinda. You see, in 1994, this would be the next game to feature Donkey Kong in a different setting, and it even went so far as to modernize him somewhat. But behind the scenes, Nintendo had even bigger plans for the gorilla. Plans that were going on before this game was being released. Plans that would radically change gaming as we knew it. A while back, we touched on some competition heating up. The bit wars James Rolfe loves to talk about so much were in full effect by the early 90s, and believe me, stuff wouldn't be easier by Nintendo as time went on. Actually, I think it's safe to say that Nintendo never really went back to that spot as the definitive gaming presence to follow. I mean, have you seen Nintendo in good graces recently? I mean, there has to be one point in time where you've thought negatively about Nintendo the past 20 or so years. From then on, the early 90s, it was a matter of survival, and by that point they didn't have all the accolades and history to back up the fact that they could really stick around forever. When the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive was at its prime, it was really quite the contender against Super Nintendo. But could Rare really handle the future of Nintendo by 1994? Well, they had technology by their side, but there needed to be a good use for it, otherwise it wouldn't catch on. But what exactly was Nintendo so worried about at this time? We already had impressive looking games like Star Fox and F-Zero, so what made this timing so special? Aladdin. No, really. Aladdin for Sega Genesis was touted as being a heavy hitter against Nintendo. Being released to coincide with the home VHS release, overall, it ended up being the third best-selling game on the console, just under Sonic 1 and 2. It was smooth, well-animated, and was just generally a good game. Even though Nintendo assigned Capcom to release an SNES Aladdin game around the same time, many saw Sega outdoing them by getting the better game out first, looking better animation-wise, and most importantly, these days, people still debate on which version of the game is better, which, in all honesty, is pretty hard to do since they're actually somewhat different, despite having the same name. But for 1993, the Sega Genesis version was really impressive and was a pointer for Rare to take when Nintendo wanted them to make a game that had, quote-unquote, better graphics than Aladdin. So, you could say there was an urge there for Nintendo to really step their game up and show that their console won't be bested on a graphical level by Sega. With another Zelda and Mario title not coming for a little while and Nintendo's R&D 1 team focusing on Super Metroid, Rare had to opt for the scarcely used Donkey Kong IP to develop a newer, better-looking game than anything Sega could come up with. Keep in mind, Donkey Kong, not Jr., hadn't been seen in a new game since 1983. It was a great idea though, since it was a way for Rare to play it safe in case they messed up. What young gamer in the early 90s would still find Donkey Kong appealing when two titans were duking it out to see who could make the better-looking and better-playing games? Kong was like a legacy lead character for Nintendo, so even though it might have seemed weird at first to put such an old icon on the face of this awesome looking game, it made sense in regards to seeing how the company could reinvent itself and the characters if need be. And of course, Rare had to modernize the character and give him an actual world to explore and aside from the construction site from hell. I don't think anyone out there was panicking at the fact that there was so little DK lore back then though, so what could go wrong in making some now? Using the Silicon Graphics Challenger, Donkey Kong and his world were modeled on a supercomputer to make a 2D platforming game look as awesome as possible. The team at Rare even went so far as to look at some gorillas to observe possible movements for him. Of course, if DK's running was based off of an actual gorilla, it'd probably be kind of awkward, so instead they made him gallop, like a horse. And then there was the question of DK Jr. At first they were going to bring him in so you could switch between him and his father and take an extra hit with him, but when Rare did their whole modernization process for Jr., he looked completely unrecognizable. Nintendo didn't like the new redesign and came up with an idea that made a whole lot of sense. Call him something else! Now he shall be called Diddy. Speaking of modernization, Shigeru Miyamoto was responsible for giving DK his tie. I mean, it's the only thing he wears, but it first appeared in the other Donkey Kong game that came out in 1994. Other than that, Miyamoto stayed pretty far away from DKC's creation while he was busy with Yoshi's Island, although he did apparently suggest the hand slap move, which doesn't really do all that much. Ah, Shigeru. What a great idea, man. Give DK an enemy to fight, friends, mechanics, you got a game. And yeah, people have sung this game's praises enough. And if I'm here denouncing that, then what is the point of this video? Well, I more so want to talk about its place in history and what it means in terms of cultural context. Enough people have already praised its mechanics and debated which games and series hold up the most. But when we look at when this game was first released in '94, we can truly realize not how important and acceptable this game was to us, but how it influenced the coming of events as a result of being a part of that 90s zeitgeist. Now, since Nintendo was fully backing this game with their full trust in Rare's hands, you know Donkey Kong Country got an outrageous amount of marketing around it. It was being covered in magazines, featured in VHS promo tapes, on the news. If you were a Nintendo fan, you could not miss this game. You know what else Donkey Kong Country was a part of? The Play It Loud campaign. What, are you kidding me? This guy was the poster boy for it. Now consider how important this is right here given our hindsight. When the game was being released by late '94, the Sony PlayStation was on its way, as was the Sega Saturn, and the N64 was announced, but nowhere ready to be shown off. You know what Nintendo was also announcing around this time? The Virtual Boy. You know, that console that promised a lot and never gave, and instead made way for a lot of inconveniences like headaches and neck and back pain. The same console that didn't get a link cable released because the damn thing failed so hard before a multiplayer game could be published. The same console that doesn't actually use virtual reality. Now look, I know what some of you savvy video game historians are thinking. Chris, Super Metroid was amazing and was released around the same time as Donkey Kong Country was. Who the hell cares if it was released or not? Well, listen up, I know the ESRB rating for this game says K to A, but which game do you think had the most impact towards marketing for the Super Nintendo? Don't get me wrong, Super Metroid was an amazing first-party title released around the same time. But let's be honest, how many parents would willingly buy that for their kids when they see the colorful monkey game right next to it? Donkey Kong Country appealed to everyone, and was the best-selling game on the console to not be developed by Nintendo with over 9 million copies sold. It was also one of the fastest-selling games for its time, which for 1994, 3 years after the system launched, is hella impressive! Yoshi's Island only sold half as many as that when it was released in 1995, and Super Metroid, one of the other flag bearers for the Play It Loud campaign, would only sell just over 1 million. It's with all these observations that I believe Donkey Kong Country, and its eventual sequels, helped keep Nintendo afloat for the next 2 years as proof that the company was competent, even while it would be a little late towards the next generation of gaming. Plus, with being able to withstand Nintendo's failures of around that time, like the Philips CDI and the Virtual Boy, along with helping in usher that Play It Loud campaign, kept the company relevant and in people's good books even up until today. I mean, think about how many people bring up Donkey Kong Country whenever they talk about the Super Nintendo. It was a major success, even if it was released a little late in the SNES's life cycle. I mean, just look around you. Donkey and Diddy are staples of Nintendo, and their designs from that game are still used today. Donkey Kong Country also brought us big hopes for the future, as it just so happens that the next Nintendo console would go on to be developed using a CPU chip made by Silicon Graphics. Project Reality they called that first in 1993, then Ultra 64, until it was finally released in 96 as the Nintendo 64. And with Rare doing so good as a result of DKC, Nintendo let them run wild on potential AAA games for their new console. Now, as great as all that was, with even Time magazine calling the console the 1996 Machine of the Year, there were always going to be skeptics about Nintendo's decision to stick with cartridges rather than going with a CD-ROM based format. And I would imagine that it was based off of stuff like the Philips CDI and the Sega CD failing, that Nintendo just didn't want to go the way of their competitors. They also said that it made it harder to pirate their games, but unfortunately at the cost of losing third-party support, such as developers like Square and Enix. There's a reason why there's a lot less games for the N64 than there were for other consoles around that time. Even the Sega Saturn and Dreamcast. Not the Atari Jaguar though. That thing bombed hard. And think about this. If Nintendo never had any experience in the gaming industry and somehow still made the N64 happen and released it around the same time, I don't think it would have made the same impact as it did in our actual timeline. Did I actually just say that? The reason the N64 is looked so fondly of, aside from a myriad of great games, was brand recognition. Nintendo survived the SNES days, and people were waiting on what these leaders of gaming were going to do for the next generation of consoles. And who was there to help out during the N64's lifespan? Rare. Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, Diddy Kong Racing, Conker, Jet Force Gemini, Mickey Speedway Perfect Dark, Blast Corps, and the big daddy of them all, GoldenEye 007! Yes, really! Who would have thought that a movie licensed game would take third place in best-selling N64 game? I mean, here's a list of games that it outsold. And again, this all goes back to Donkey Kong Country, an experiment made to show what Rare could do on Super Nintendo. An experiment made to revitalize a character. An experiment that would lead a movement, an experiment that would hold the fortress down, an experiment that created a dynasty, opened up new worlds, treaded new technological ground, and got us ready for gaming in 3D. Would Nintendo have survived the 90s had Donkey Kong Country never been made? I don't know. We didn't even mention the 64 GD. This thing was promised as a disc add-on for the N64. It was supposed to come out before the main console was released, but it ended up coming out in December of 1999, and only in Japan. But because it came out so late, we were robbed of stuff like Zelda, Fire Emblem 64, and Earthbound 64, and games like Ocarina of Time ended up being delayed as a result of technical issues, and switching to a cartridge from a magnetic disc. You know what? In short, the N64 era stresses me the hell out, and it probably did the same to a lot of other people. Just take away this. When you talk about the N64, you can't leave out Rare. Even when their only project on the GameCube, Star Fox Adventures, gets criticized for being different, critics still praise it. Taking Donkey Kong Country and its innovations and place and time out of the equation would negate all that and so much more. Imagine how much Nintendo and other video game companies and developers have built off of its success. A big one now is Retro Studios, who found modern success with the Donkey Kong Country Return series. So the legacy of the old 1994 game still lives on, even on the physical playable level on Nintendo Switch. Well, I mean, if you don't count the long list of games Donkey Kong's already playable in just from being a part of the greater Mario universe. But if that weren't the case, DK would have probably stayed as a one-time villain like so many. But anyways, that's what I think. How different do you think Nintendo would have been if Rare was never given the chance to make Donkey Kong Country? And do you think the company would be capable enough of standing on its own with just Mario, Zelda, and some other well-received first-party franchise? Leave a comment down below if your own theories are better intuition, and I might just pin ya. Anyways, it's been great. I'll see you soon. Peace.